Good day. Before I proceed with this program, let me again remind you that you can find us now on Rumble, which is now from time to time publishing videos that we make on the Duran on its homepage. If you want to find us on Rumble, you can of course also type the Duran in the search bar, and you can also type Alexander Mercouris or Alex Christoforou in the search bar as well, and that will take you directly to our channels. And if you watch any of our videos on Rumble, if you look at the top of the video, you will see a red maroon button. If you press that red maroon button, that will take you straight to our locals homepage, where we have a thriving community, many of whom publish their own content, and where Alex Christoforou and I each publish our own exclusive content, and where I do live streams on Wednesdays. So please look out for that. Look us up on Rumble, check us out on locals as well. Now, in addition to that, I'm going to just also repeat a comment that I made in my last video. We're obviously entering a very tense time in international relations. There's a high probability, some would say, of a war in Ukraine. There's always a possibility that some people will overreact to that. They have in the past, and we've seen all sorts of restrictions and things being placed on people who try to publish content. Now, this is not a warning. I'm not expecting anything to be done to this channel, but in case it is, then please bear in mind that you can also find us, as I said, on locals and on Rumble, as well as on our various other platforms, of which you will find links under this video. Perhaps you might take a particular interest, amongst others, on Odyssey and SuperU. So let's now proceed to the events of the last few hours. Now, there's been a lot more shelling in the Donbass, and we're now getting more reports of people being killed. But so far, the numbers of people who've been killed on each side has been very low. I think it's 3 Ukrainian soldiers and 1 or 2 civilians on the Ukrainian side. According to Ukrainian information, it's 2 Ukrainian civilians, according to militia information, on the Donbass side. I will, by the way, refer to it henceforth as the Donbass side. Everybody knows, I hope, that what I mean by that is the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And, of course, the People's Militia, as they call themselves, are the armed forces of those 2 republics. So these are the forces which are engaging each other at the moment. Now, I want to make it very clear before I proceed that I have no fully reliable source as to what is happening in terms of the fighting in the Donbass. And as I've already explained on many occasions, I'm not a military person, and the tactics and operations and all those sort of things are not really at all my area of expertise. I will leave that to others who are better able to discuss those matters than I am. However, for what it's worth, my impression is that the situation at the moment is static, that the artillery fire that's being exchanged, though considerably heavier than was the case until last Thursday for many years, nonetheless has still not reached the level where it suggests outright fighting is about to happen. There was reports from the militia that there was an attempted Ukrainian incursion and a Ukrainian advance on a settlement in the Lugansk region overnight, and the militia say that it was driven back and that the Ukrainians took some casualties. I want to stress that is the militia's information. I don't have any evidence either to prove or refute that claim. For the record, I see no reason to doubt it, but each side at the moment claims that they are strictly on the defensive and that they're simply responding to the attacks, the shelling that is taking place and which has been launched by the other side. And I would also add that the militia claim that they have caught the Ukrainian intelligence operative who was behind the attempted assassination with a car bomb of the commander of the People's Militia in the Donetsk Republic, and they've rounded up all the members of his network. Again, I've no doubt that somebody has been rounded up, has been arrested, they've given the name of this person, but I'm not going to get into discussion about this story. So far, there's been no trial, maybe there never will be. So I'm not going to go into more details about this incident, but it does suggest, if it's true, that some attempts at, shall we say, sabotage attempts and assassination attempts have been taking place, though they don't seem to have been very effective, at least up to now. So it seems to me that as of this moment, we have a fairly static situation. Each side lobbying shells, the other, not very heavy shells in most cases, but lobbying shells. This isn't happening all the time. It seems that most of the firing takes place at relatively short intervals of about an hour, with much silence at other times. But of course, the situation is extremely tense, and both sides, especially the militia side, are accusing the other of preparing for some kind of offensive, which indeed could happen at any time, in which case fighting will begin in earnest. In the meantime, diplomatic efforts to achieve some kind of ceasefire continue, and they are being led, as always, by French President Macron. He spoke to Zelensky yesterday, and Zelensky has recently come out and said that, as far as he's concerned, he supports a meeting of the Trilateral Contact Group and the announcement of an immediate ceasefire, what he calls a period of silence. And Macron has also called Putin. In fact, readouts are coming out as I am making this video, but they are still incomplete. And there's also been some confusion about some of the things that appear to have been discussed. So I'm going to reserve discussion of this Macron-Putin call until tomorrow, though I very much fear that by the time tomorrow comes, it will have been whatever Putin and Macron have discussed with each other will or may have been overtaken by events. It's possible, it's just possible, that Macron might be able to broker some kind of a ceasefire, some kind of period of silence, as Zelensky has described it. I don't personally think the Russians would object, but I have to say that the record of ceasefires in these kind of conflict situations at this stage is always tenuous. And one of the things that makes the situation particularly problematic is that the various Western countries that form the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe have pulled out their various observers from the line of conflict. The OSCE observers, the Western countries, have pulled out their OSCE personnel who are acting as observers on the line of conflict. So there is actually a very small number of people now monitoring the situation and providing reports about what is actually going on. And that, of course, is going to complicate any effort to set up a ceasefire. By the way, on that topic, the secretary of the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization floated a couple of days ago in a interview with Reuters. By the way, I would emphasize that this was an interview which took place before the present fighting in Donbass began. He floated the idea of the Collective Security Treaty Organization providing peacekeepers for the Donbass. Now, that might be part of a Russian agenda, but I would say that this official, the secretary, as I said, of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, made it very clear that it could only happen with Kiev's agreement and with some kind of international agreement, perhaps a decision of the United Nations Security Council. Now, it's not, by the way, entirely impossible. That may be the direction of travel. It may be the objective the Russians have in mind. But to be absolutely clear about it, the opposition from the Ukrainians and from Western governments at the moment makes that all but inconceivable. It would require a dramatic shift of the situation on the ground, such as happened, by the way, in 2014 and 2015 in the events that led up to the Minsk agreements. It would require something like that, an clear-cut Ukrainian military defeat on the contact line before such a peacekeeping force from the Collective Security Treaty Organization were ever inserted into this area. Having said that, it may be that this is a marker of what may come, but let's not assume that that is the case. Meanwhile, there have been parallel events going on the two sides. We've heard that we had the Munich Security Conference take place in Germany, in Munich, and I have to say, I found that one of the most depressing experiences following it that I have ever had. Anybody who wants to look at the caliber of leadership of the West at this time would have looked at what happened at the Munich Security Conference with complete despair. At least I think they would do if they were approaching this subject objectively. Kamala Harris gave a speech which was full of rhetoric and completely empty of substance, so far as I could see. Zelensky was going around making all kinds of threats about Ukraine one day perhaps acquiring nuclear weapons, something which I can't imagine anybody in the Munich Security Conference wanted to hear. And I have to say, not for the first time, he came across to me as a rather sad and pathetic person, somebody that people have to pretend to listen to and take seriously, even though in practice they don't. Chancellor Scholz of Germany blundered again when he denied Russian claims about a genocide in the Donbass. Whatever your view about that, I personally think this word genocide is wildly overused nowadays. But regardless of that, as the Russians pointed out to him, it is extremely impolitic and, to be frank, unwise for Germans to be banding around the word genocide in that way. And as far as the Russians are concerned, perhaps to an extent that Scholz himself failed to understand, this kind of language is incredibly provocative. I have to say again that the incident suggested to me that Scholz was particularly riled by the way that Putin stepped in during the press conference, and when Scholz said that NATO attacked Yugoslavia in 1999 because a genocide was being conducted in Kosovo, an absurd and wrong claim at the time, as I thought at the time, and one which, as I said, the Russians immediately took umbrage with. He seems to have been nettled by Putin's response, by the fact that Putin then immediately stepped in and said that as far as the Russians are concerned, what is going on in Ukraine and in Donbass is a genocide. And I think that he obviously wanted to respond at some level and at some point. That is, to my way of thinking, an incredibly petty and juvenile way of thinking, and it does rather reinforce my opinion of Scholz as somebody who is completely out of his league in this situation. However, if Scholz is out of his league, I'm afraid Annalena Baerbock came across to me as being utterly intoxicated with the situation. I've always been concerned that Baerbock was frankly too young and too inexperienced as a foreign minister of Germany to take charge of the German foreign ministry in this extremely tense situation that we are seeing. And sure enough, she was at the Munich Security Conference making all sorts of extraordinary claims and remarks and threats, all of which seem to echo and mirror Western talking points in a way that she has avoided doing up to now. It struck me very much as a case of an inexperienced minister, a young and inexperienced minister who has taken all the attention she's getting, has allowed it to get to her head, and who says the sort of things that she thinks her audience wants to hear. And the result is, I'm afraid, that she left a lot of the discretion which a German foreign minister, especially at this time, behind her. She left it behind her. It has to be said that Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, far exceeded even Baerbock in windy rhetoric. He made all sorts of sub-Churchillian comments about, how whatever the Russian invasion plan in Ukraine is, it mustn't just fail, it must be seen to fail. Talked in an extraordinary way. And again, I have to say that listening to Johnson, as I had previously felt when I was listening to Kamala Harris, there seemed an extraordinary mismatch between his rhetoric and the actual steps that Britain says it is taking in this situation. Both in Kamala Harris's case and in Boris Johnson's case, they spoke as if they were standing shoulder to shoulder in defense of Ukraine. Except, of course, that they're not. They're not actually taking any step to defend Ukraine from this Russian aggression that they claim is threatened. On the contrary, they've pulled all their people out of Ukraine, or at least out of most of their people out of Ukraine, and are hurriedly relocating all their diplomatic staff to Lvov. I'll come back to that, by the way, in a moment, because I have some information about the American embassy and what's happened to it in Ukraine. But anyway, they're all scuttling out in a way that doesn't seem to me to correspond at all with the courageous and heroic poses that Kamala Harris and Boris Johnson, and by the way also Jens Stoltenberg, were posing. So it already looks like a bizarre mismatch. And then, of course, it got a little worse because the British announces their great contribution to this great struggle against Russia, the fact that they're going to take action to clamp down on oligarch wealth, Russian oligarch wealth in London. It seems that they are entirely oblivious to the fact that doing this serves Vladimir Putin's purposes. The oligarchs who have money in London have it there because they don't want it to come under the scrutiny of the Russian tax collector and of the Russian state. Most of them are not Vladimir Putin's friends. They are his political opponents. In some cases, they are his outright enemies. What Boris Johnson and the British government are proposing to do would not, I think, disappoint Putin at all. The Russian Foreign Ministry has already sneered that Putin has already advised Russian businessmen to keep their wealth in Russia and not risk it by sending it abroad. What it would actually do is not trouble Putin or weaken Putin or undermine the position of his government. It would strengthen it instead. This is, I think, a constant misconception that Western governments, Western officials have had about Russia ever since Putin took over. They imagine that he is somehow the creature of the oligarchs, and on this they could not be more completely wrong. I remember, and in fact there was a recent article which I saw which confirmed it again, but I remember how back in 2014 Angela Merkel was advised by the German intelligence service, the BND, that if sectoral sanctions were imposed on Russia in 2014, the oligarchs would quickly bring Putin to heel. And the collective West were all astonished when that failed to happen. But judging by what the British are preparing to do and what they're talking about doing, nothing very much has been learned from that particular debacle. So there we are, all of these people talking a lot, but without much sense in Munich. By contrast, we saw perhaps rather more structured moves being made in Moscow. We've had, first of all, these nuclear defense exercises, these nuclear strategic exercises, which, by the way, the Russians engage in on a regular basis every year, and which are part of the sequence of exercises we have seen at the moment. I don't think, again, that the timing of these exercises has any particular relevance. The purpose of these exercises, the main issue of these exercises, the purpose of the exercises was to test Russia's strategic defense forces to ensure that they are responsive to instructions from Moscow. And in that, apparently, they were successful. But they had, of course, a secondary purpose, which is, of course, to demonstrate to the world that Alexander Lukashenko and Belarus are now fully and completely integrated into the Russian military system, right up to the very highest levels. Lukashenko attended with Putin at Putin's command post these exercises. He was physically there. Obviously, this was partly intended to impress him, which no doubt it did, but also it was intended to show to the world that Lukashenko is now part of the team, part of the Russian team, in a way that he has never been up to now, with Belarus becoming fully integrated, not just into the Russian economic system, but into the Russian military system as well. So this was the key message that the Russians wanted to convey via his presence with Putin at the command post. No other world leader, apart possibly from Xi Jinping, would be given that sort of honor or that sort of place by the Russians as Lukashenko was over the course of this exercise, being physically in the room with Putin, in Putin's command post, as that exercise was taking place. If nothing else, what it demonstrates is the extraordinary trust and confidence that the Russians now have in Lukashenko, their belief that he will not disclose to the Western powers any of the exceptionally sensitive information that he must have gleaned through his attendance at this particular exercise. So that's what I wanted to say about that. But in terms of the Ukrainian situation, of course, all of this is overshadowed by the announcement from Belarus today that the Belarusians have asked the Russians to keep their forces the forces that have been engaged in these exercises in Belarus, that they've asked them to remain. And the Belarusian defense minister has now said that those Russian troops are going to stay in Belarus pretty much indefinitely. Now, of course, that may have been the plan all along. Quite possibly it was. But it seems to me that if it wasn't, then the present fighting in Belarus has made, in eastern Ukraine, has made that happen. And in which case, that begs the question of why precisely this thing was carried out, because, of course, this military, political, economic integration of Belarus into the Russian military, political and economic system, I can't really see how that serves Western interests. I would add that I've been told informally that it also means that the Baltic states have now been rendered instantly and completely undefendable. Whether that's again the case or not, military people are in a better position to discuss than me. Anyway, that, it seems to me, is the major events that have been taking place there with the Russians and the Belarusians. These discussions clearly which have been taking place in Moscow. Just before I did this video, there were reports that Blinken still is intending to meet Lavrov on either Wednesday or Thursday. It's unclear where, and it's unclear when exactly. And that Biden is now floating the possibility of a summit meeting with Putin, an urgent summit meeting. He's apparently said that he's prepared to contact and speak to Putin in any format. Any format implies a willingness to meet Putin in person if this will avoid a war in Europe. So we'll see what's happening and whether anything will come of this, and whether there will be some kind of physical or virtual or telephonic communication between Biden and Putin before very long. And we will see whether Macron's efforts to broker a ceasefire are effective. I would say that there is growing evidence now of Russian preparations with respect to the events in Donbass. There's been more and more reports, which I can't remotely corroborate, but which appear to be based on social media, of heavy Russian artillery moving into position along the Russian-Ukrainian border, where they would be in a position to intervene, and intervene with overwhelming force if given the order in any fighting in the Donbass. And I would say that two Russian state organizations, the Emergencies Ministry, EMERCOM, and the leading Russian crime-fighting organization, the Investigative Committee, apparently now actually have their personnel present in the Donbass. EMERCOM is now apparently involved in facilitating the civilian evacuations. The Investigative Committee is apparently in the process of building up some kind of legal case, presumably based on war crimes and human rights and humanitarian law. So I would say that those two institutions are, by Russian admission, actively present in the Donbass at this time. Of course, that's a very different thing. The presence of these organizations is a very different matter from the presence of Russian troops in the Donbass. As of now, the Russians deny that they have any of their troops there. So that's where we are. Growing Russian moves. They're keeping their troops in Belarus. They're tightening their integration with Belarus. Lukashenko is becoming integrated into the Russian political and command system, and via him, Belarus itself as well. And the Russians may be preparing their forces around Ukraine in case things get out of hand there. And as I said, EMERCOM and the Investigative Committee are in action. And as I said, on the other side, lots of windy rhetoric, but the only person who seems to have kept his head. It was striking, by the way, that he did not participate in this extraordinary display of rhetorical excess that we saw in Munich, is Emmanuel Macron, who once again is working the phones. He's been talking to Zelensky, he's been talking to Putin, he's apparently been talking to Biden as well, as he tries to get some kind of ceasefire up and running in eastern Ukraine. We will see whether or not he succeeds. At the moment, it must be said, that looks extremely unlikely. I'm going to finish with this. It does seem to me that, going back to my earlier comment, the quality of Western leadership as put on display at that conference in Munich is abject. This is not a time for striking poses. It's a time for trying to find some kind of solution to this matter. Why are we in this crisis at all? It is for two reasons. Firstly, because of this disastrous policy of extending NATO eastwards that has been pursued relentlessly since the 1990s. Now, the German magazine Der Spiegel has done a long series of articles, a rather long article, peppered with references and documents and all sorts of things, which to my mind and to the in the opinion, I think, of any objective person who has read it, confirms conclusively that the Russians were indeed promised, as they have repeatedly said, that they were indeed promised at the end of the 1980s and in the early 1990s that NATO would not be expanded eastwards if the Soviet Union pulled Russia pulled its forces out of Eastern Europe. Moreover, a particular document found in the British archives has shown something which has been disputed up to now, that this is an agreed and coordinated policy worked out by all of the Western powers. It's shown that there was a meeting of senior officials of all of the top Western countries, France, Germany, Britain and the United States, in which they were agreeing their positions in advance of the processes of German reunification. And this confirms conclusively, because it's referred to in the minutes of this meeting, that the Western powers were all agreed on a policy of giving reassurances to the Russians that NATO would indeed not be expanded eastward. So it seems to me that the fact that the Russians were given those promises is now indisputable. I personally have never had any doubt about this. But anyway, those promises were clearly not kept, and that is one of the reasons for the crisis that we now see. And the other reason is the series of events which began in 2013 with the protests that were backed by Western governments. I can remember people like Victoria Nuland attending the protests in Kiev at that time. A series of events backed by Western governments, culminating in protests which overthrew the Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, the constitutionally and democratically elected Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, because he refused, or rather he delayed ratification and signing of an association agreement that his diplomats had negotiated with the European Union. And that set in train a sequence of events leading to a war in the Donbass in 2014 and 2015, which culminated in a peace agreement, the Minsk II agreement, which the Ukrainians have never implemented and which Western governments have never put pressure on the Ukrainians to implement. And it is the failure to fulfill either the promise given to the Russians that NATO would not be expanded eastward, or the pathway to peace laid out in the Minsk agreement, which is behind this crisis today. Of course, this is nowhere acknowledged, and nor is it acknowledged how precarious the situation of the West, or at least of Europe, has in some ways become. There could be a war in Ukraine. Foreign Policy magazine has now published a long article which for the first time acknowledges the possibility that if there was a war in Ukraine, far from being bogged down, Russia might win conclusively, and that this would have a catastrophic effect on the West's position, NATO's position in Europe. It might severely shake the whole architecture, the whole security architecture of Europe. But also, perhaps more immediately, there is the fact that whilst all this talk of sanctions is taking place, and even those sanctions, as I said, have been hollowed out. Apparently there's no more talk of disconnecting Russia from SWIFT. There's no more Russian banks will be restricted. Some Russian banks will be restricted in using the dollar. And there will be bans on exports of very high technology products to Russia. All, as I said, problematic things. By the way, the ruble remained remarkably stable all last week. Might not continue that way if things continue to boil up, but for the moment, clearly the markets are not particularly, Russian markets are not particularly fazed by all those sanctions threats. But even as the West talks about these perhaps not especially effective sanctions, they are overlooking, it seems to me, how their own energy position is deteriorating. Gazprom has now published a report in which it says that the amount of gas in Europe's underground reserves has now been almost completely exhausted. It has fallen to single-figure percentage points. Over 90% of it has been used. And this happened at roughly the same time as there was a report by Reuters saying that the terminals, European terminals to process liquefied natural gas, are now at absolute capacity. They simply cannot absorb any more, and it comes nowhere close, obviously, to fulfilling the needs, satisfying the needs that the Western powers, that Europe needs in terms of gas. So you would have thought that this would be the issue that Western leaders, people like Scholz and Johnson and Annalena Baerbock and all of these people, that they would be worried and concerned about, and indeed Kamala Harris would be worried and concerned about. But it seems this is not the case. Instead, we get all this windy rhetoric coming out of Munich, competing with Storm Eunice, which has been flying across the continent. Lots of empty words. As I said, nothing very much in terms of practical action. Though, actually, there has been one form of practical action, and I'm going to now mention what it is, and it is a disturbing story. Now, I have to say, I'm not yet in a position to disclose the source of this information. It's somebody who circulates information he's in the United States, which comes to him from various sources. He seems to be extremely well informed and very well placed. He sends private emails to a variety of people, including, to my knowledge, the lawyer Robert Barnes, who joins us regularly on programs for the Duran. But he circulates material to lots of people, including, I believe, members of Congress. And I understand that he's not averse to having his name disclosed. And after I've completed this video, I will contact him to find out whether in future broadcasts I can disclose it. But anyway, he has researched the question of what has happened to the US Embassy in Ukraine. And the United States, the State Department, announced that this embassy, the embassy in Kiev, had been relocated from Kiev to the West Ukrainian city of Lvov. And by the way, the CIA station in Ukraine has apparently been evacuated from Ukraine entirely, or so the claim, or so we hear. Well, this person decided that he would look into the question of whether or not, where exactly in Lvov or Lviv, this US embassy is actually now located. And he discovered, to his astonishment, that the embassy has not, in fact, moved in to any building. There is no physical US embassy in Lviv. In fact, his opinion is that there is no functioning US embassy anywhere at all in Ukraine at the moment. There are some US diplomats in Lviv, but they are all occupying hotel rooms. They haven't even rented apartments as they could do, which strongly suggests that their presence in Lviv is going to be temporary also. So it seems that there is no US embassy functioning anywhere in Ukraine. And of course, the NATO mission in Ukraine has now also been pulled out. And it seems that most of its personnel are being relocated not to Lviv, but actually to Brussels. I have to say that it does increasingly look as if Ukraine is being abandoned. And if so, then that makes an interesting counter to all these talks of standing by Ukraine, all these speeches of standing by Ukraine. We heard from the likes of Kamala Harris and Boris Johnson and Annalena Baerbock and Olaf Scholz at the security conference in Munich. If the real plan is to abandon Ukraine to its fate, perhaps it's now come to be recognized as the liability that it is, and perhaps the decision has been made to pull out in one way or another and to abandon the country to its fate, but to do so in the form of a fighting retreat, one which doesn't require making any kind of concessions to the Russians, such as the Minsk Agreement and the Russian draft treaties might require, and one which can be soiled by imposing sanctions whilst beating this retreat. After all, that's what's been done to Afghanistan. Well, if that is the plan, and I should stress again, I don't know whether it is, but if that is the plan, then perhaps when the plan is implemented, we can revisit all these brave speeches in Munich and assess them for what they really mean. Well, on that somewhat sour note, thank you for joining me today for this update. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs on this channel. Remember what I said before about the fact that you can find us on these other platforms, especially Rumble and Locals, but also on the various other platforms that you can find also if you check out the links below this video. And also you can, of course, support us via Patreon and a Subscribe Star. If you like our work, you can go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our bomber jackets, all those amazing things. And I look forward to you joining me again in future programs. I will continue, obviously, to cover this crisis in detail. And in the meantime, I wish you all a good day. And I would remind you again to check your subscription to this channel and to tick the like button to this video if you have liked it. So thank you again. Thank you for joining me, and good day.